The winter of 1878 came early to the Arizona Territory, and it came with a vengeance that even the oldest prospectors couldn't remember seeing before. Samuel Crawford had been tracking through the Mogollon Rim for 3 days, his supplies running low and his hope running lower. He wasn't a young man anymore, 42 years had weathered his face like the canyon walls around him, but he was stubborn enough to believe he could still make his fortune in these unforgiving mountains. That's when he saw her. She appeared like a ghost through the swirling snow, stumbling between the ponderosa pines with nothing but a torn deerskin dress and worn moccasins. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. An Apache girl, no more than 16 or 17, her lips blue with cold, her long black hair matted with ice. She collapsed 20 feet from where he stood, and for a moment, Samuel froze, not from the cold, but from the fear that had been drilled into settlers like him for years. The Apache raids, the stories of violence, the warnings to trust no one. But then she looked up at him, and Samuel saw something that shattered every prejudice he'd carried into these mountains. He saw the same thing he'd seen in his own daughter's eyes the day she'd gotten lost in a snowstorm back in Ohio, pure, desperate terror. "Please," she whispered in broken English, a word she'd clearly learned from missionaries or traders. "Please." Samuel made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. He dropped his rifle, rushed forward, and caught her before she fell face first into the snow. She was light as a feather, her body trembling violently against his chest. He half carried, half dragged her to his small canvas tent, his mind racing with 1,000 questions he didn't have answers to. Inside, Samuel worked quickly, wrapping her in his only spare blanket and building up the fire until the small space glowed with warmth. She didn't speak, just watched him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to calculate whether he was savior or threat. Samuel heated water in his tin pot and offered it to her with shaking hands. She drank greedily, then coughed, her whole body convulsing with the effort. "What happened to you?" Samuel asked, though he didn't expect her to understand or answer. To his surprise, she did both. "Soldiers," she said, her voice raw. "They attack, my people. I run. I hide. 3 days, no food." The words came out haltingly, but Samuel understood. Another raid, another chapter in the endless cycle of violence that plagued this territory. He'd heard the soldiers talking in the last town. They were planning a clearing operation against an Apache camp suspected of harboring raiders. Samuel had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, looking at this terrified girl, he felt shame burn hotter than the fire between them. "You're safe now," he said, though he had no idea if that was true. "Rest." She closed her eyes, but Samuel could see she didn't really sleep. She was too alert, too ready to run. He couldn't blame her. For all she knew, he might turn her into the army for a reward, or worse. The fact that she'd approached him at all spoke to how desperate she must have been. As night fell, the temperature plummeted further. Samuel had been through cold nights before, but this was different. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and he could feel the chill seeping through the canvas walls despite the fire. The girl, he realized he didn't even know her name, began to shake again, violent tremors that made her teeth chatter audibly. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, moving closer to add another log to the fire. "Nailnish," she managed between shivers. "Means, she works." "I'm Samuel," he replied. "But most folks call me Sam." Nailnish nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. But Samuel could see it wasn't enough. Hypothermia was setting in, and if he didn't do something soon, saving her from the snow would have been pointless. He'd seen men die from exposure before. It was a peaceful death, they said, like falling asleep. But there was nothing peaceful about watching someone fade away when you had the power to help. Samuel made another decision that would have scandalized the good folks back in Ohio. He added every piece of spare clothing he had to her blanket, then wrapped his own coat around her shoulders. When she was still shaking 30 minutes later, he did something that surprised even himself. He lay down beside her, carefully, respectfully, adding his body heat to the meager warmth of the fire and blankets. "It's okay," he said softly when she tensed. "Just trying to keep you alive. Nothing more, I swear it." Gradually, her trembling subsided. They lay there in the howling darkness, two strangers from worlds that were supposed to be enemies, sharing the most basic human gift, warmth. Samuel stared at the canvas ceiling, thinking about his own daughter, Emily, who would be about Nailnish's age now. He'd left Ohio 10 years ago after his wife died, chasing dreams of gold and glory, telling himself he'd send for Emily once he struck it rich. But the years had passed, the gold had eluded him, and the letters from his sister, who was raising Emily, had grown more infrequent and more reproachful. "Why you help me?" Nailnish asked suddenly, her English clearer now that she was warming up. It was a fair question, and Samuel didn't have a simple answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I have a daughter. If she was lost and afraid, I'd hope someone would help her too." Nailnish was quiet for a moment. "Your daughter, where?" "Ohio. Far away. I left her to come here, to make money." Saying it aloud made Samuel realize how hollow it sounded. "Haven't seen her in 10 years. 10 winters." Nailnish sounded shocked. "That is, very long. In my people, family is everything. We never leave." The simple words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Here he was, saving a stranger's daughter while his own child grew up without a father. What kind of man did that make him? "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been a fool." They fell silent again, and eventually, Samuel heard Nailnish's breathing become deep and regular. She had finally fallen asleep. He stayed awake, watching over her, thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment, alone in a tent in the Arizona wilderness, keeping an Apache girl warm while a blizzard raged outside. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Samuel crawled out of the tent to assess their situation. The snow had stopped, but the world was buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. Getting down the mountain would be treacherous, and his supplies were running dangerously low. But that wasn't his biggest problem. As he stood in the fresh snow, surveying the pristine landscape, Samuel heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices. Men's voices. And they were speaking English. He turned to see 5 cavalry soldiers emerging from the tree line, led by a hard-faced lieutenant who looked at Samuel's tent with undisguised suspicion. "Morning," the lieutenant said, though his tone suggested it was anything but good. "We're tracking a hostile Apache girl, about 16 years old. You seen anyone matching that description?" Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. Inside the tent, he knew Nailnish was awake and listening, probably terrified out of her mind. He thought about his daughter again, about the kind of man he wanted to be versus the kind of man he'd become. And in that moment, Samuel Crawford made the most important decision of his life. Samuel looked the lieutenant straight in the eye and did something he'd never done in his 42 years, he lied to an officer of the United States Army. "Haven't seen a soul in 3 days," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This storm's been too fierce. Anyone out in it without proper shelter would be dead by now." The lieutenant studied him with narrow, suspicious eyes. "You sure about that?" "We tracked footprints leading right to this area before the snow covered them up. Small prints. Indian prints." Samuel shrugged, praying that the soldiers couldn't hear his heart pounding. "Could be any number of things. Animals, maybe. Like I said, I've been alone out here." One of the younger soldiers, barely old enough to shave, spoke up. "Lieutenant, maybe we should check his tent. Just to be sure." Samuel felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "You're welcome to look, but I warn you, it's a mess in there. Bachelor living, you know." He forced a chuckle, trying to sound casual. "Though I'd appreciate if you didn't track snow all over my bedroll. Hard enough staying dry as it is." The lieutenant took a step toward the tent, and Samuel knew this was it. In seconds, they'd find Nailnish, and everything would be over. She'd be taken back to a reservation or worse, and Samuel would probably be arrested for harboring a fugitive. But more than his own fate, what haunted him was the thought of betraying the trust of that terrified girl who had risked everything by approaching his camp. Then something extraordinary happened. The lieutenant stopped mid-stride, his attention caught by something in the distance. A plume of smoke was rising from behind the next ridge, perhaps a mile away. "Sergeant," he barked, "you see that?" "Yes, sir." "Could be a campfire." The lieutenant's demeanor changed instantly, his focus shifting from Samuel to this new possibility. "Mount up, men. That could be our hostel or others from her band." He turned back to Samuel, his expression still suspicious but now divided in its attention. "You stay put, old-timer. We'll be back this way to check your story. And if we find out you've been lying—" "You won't," Samuel said firmly. "I've got no love for the Apache or anyone else. Just want to be left alone to prospect in peace." The soldiers moved out quickly, their horses struggling through the deep snow but making better progress than men on foot could manage. Samuel watched them disappear over the ridge, his legs suddenly weak with relief. He waited another 5 minutes, making sure they weren't doubling back, before ducking back into the tent. Nailnish sat in the corner, wrapped in the blanket, her eyes wide. You not tell them," she whispered, and Samuel could hear the wonder in her voice. "Why?" Samuel sat down heavily, his hands still shaking from the encounter. "Because what they're doing isn't right. You're not hostile, you're just a scared kid trying to survive. And—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I'm tired of being the kind of man who looks the other way when something wrong is happening." Nailnish stared at him for a long moment, and Samuel saw tears gathering in her eyes. "My family," she said softly. "The soldiers, they kill many. My mother, my little brother. I see them fall. I run because my father yelled at me to run, to live." The tears spilled over now, tracking down her weathered cheeks. "I leave them. I leave them all." Samuel moved closer, his own throat tight with emotion. "You did what any survivor does. You lived. That's not betrayal, that's honoring their sacrifice." "Your daughter," Nailnish said suddenly, wiping her eyes. "You must go to her. You must not waste more winters. Family is everything." The simple wisdom in her words cracked something open in Samuel's chest. Here was this girl who had lost everything, and she was counseling him about the importance of family. She was right, of course. She'd been right from the beginning. All his excuses about making money, about building something to give Emily, they were just that. Excuses. What Emily needed wasn't gold or a big house. She needed her father. "I will," Samuel promised. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." Over the next hour, Samuel formed a plan. The cavalry would be occupied for a while chasing that smoke, probably just a prospector's campfire or trappers, but they'd be back. He needed to move quickly. He packed his tent and meager supplies, giving Nailnish his warmest clothes and an extra pair of boots that were too big but better than her frozen moccasins. Then he led her on a circuitous route through the mountains, heading not toward the settlements where soldiers patrolled, but toward an area he'd heard about from an old Mexican trader. 3 days later, exhausted and nearly out of food, Samuel and Nailnish reached a remote canyon where a small band of Apache lived in relative peace. They were led by an elder named Geronimo, not the famous warrior, but a medicine man who had chosen peace over war. When Samuel explained what had happened, the old man studied them both with eyes that seemed to see into their souls. "You risk much," Geronimo said in surprisingly good English. "Soldiers would hang you for helping her." "Maybe," Samuel admitted. "But I couldn't do otherwise. Not anymore." Geronimo nodded slowly, then spoke to Nailnish in their language. She responded, her words tumbling out in a rush, and Samuel saw the old man's expression soften. When she finished, Geronimo turned back to Samuel. "She says you saved her life. Twice. Once from cold, once from soldiers." He paused, considering. "She also says you have daughter you must find. This is true?" "Yes," Samuel said. "In Ohio." "Then you must go," Geronimo said. "But know this, you have made family here too. Apache do not forget debts of honor. If ever you need help, you have only to ask. We will remember Samuel, the white man who chose kindness over fear." Samuel felt his eyes sting with unexpected tears. He turned to Nailnish, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You'll be safe here," he told her. "You'll have a family again." Nailnish stepped forward and did something that surprised him. She took his weathered hand in both of hers, the Apache way of showing deep respect and gratitude. "You show me white men can be good," she said softly. "You show me that heart is more important than skin. I will remember Samuel always." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "And when you find daughter, tell her she have brave father. Tell her he finally come home." Samuel left the canyon that evening, his pack lighter but his heart fuller than it had been in years. He didn't head back to the mining camps or the prospects that had lured him west. Instead, he turned his horse east, toward Ohio, toward Emily, toward the life he should have been living all along. It took Samuel 3 months to reach Ohio, selling everything he owned along the way to pay for passage. When he finally knocked on his sister's door in the little town where he'd grown up, he was terrified of what he'd find. Would Emily even remember him? Would she forgive him for abandoning her? The door opened, and a young woman stood there, no longer a child, but not quite grown. She had her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. "Papa?" Emily whispered, and the hope in that single word nearly broke him. "I'm home," Samuel said, his voice cracking. "I'm finally home." Emily flew into his arms, and Samuel held his daughter for the first time in 10 years, tears streaming down his face. Over her shoulder, he saw his sister watching from the doorway, her own eyes wet with emotion. That night, as they sat around the fire and Samuel tried to explain where he'd been and why he'd finally come back, he told them about Nailnish. About a freezing night in Arizona when a terrified Apache girl had stumbled into his camp, and how saving her had somehow saved him too. "She reminded me what matters," Samuel said, looking at his daughter. "She helped me understand that real wealth isn't gold in the ground. It's people. It's family. It's choosing compassion even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous." Emily took his hand, squeezing it tight. "I'm glad she found you, Papa. And I'm glad you found your way home." Samuel thought about Nailnish often in the years that followed. He never saw her again, but he heard stories from traders and travelers about a remarkable Apache woman who became a bridge between her people and the settlers, who spoke of